"Sir, if you can't afford to eat here, you shouldn't be taking up a table." The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They landed with the quiet weight of judgment that people like Daniel Hayes had learned to recognize long before they were spoken. And for a moment, the hum of the diner, forks clinking against ceramic plates, coffee machines hissing in the background, low conversations drifting like static, seemed to pause just enough for everyone to notice him sitting there in his worn denim jacket, hands folded calmly on the table, a single plate of food in front of him that had taken the better part of his last $12 to afford. Daniel didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't defend himself the way pride might have tempted a younger man to do. Instead, he simply nodded once, slow and measured, the kind of nod that said more about dignity than any speech ever could. And just as the waitress turned away with a faint shake of her head, as if closing a chapter she had already judged, Daniel's eyes shifted, not in frustration, not in shame, but in quiet awareness, toward the far corner of the diner where a woman sat alone, still as winter, her hands wrapped loosely around an untouched cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, her coat thin for the season, her posture straight but fragile in a way that didn't quite match the rest of her presence. She hadn't said a word since she walked in, hadn't looked up when the door chimed or when the laughter at Daniel's expense rippled softly through the room. But there was something about her silence that felt different, not empty, not broken, but deliberate, like someone who had chosen not to speak rather than someone who had forgotten how. Daniel watched her for a second longer than most people would allow themselves, then glanced down at his plate, then back at her, and in that small space between hunger and instinct, something settled quietly inside him. He stood, picked up his plate without hesitation, and walked across the diner floor, his boots echoing softly against the worn tiles as a few heads turned, curious now, mildly amused, expecting perhaps another awkward moment, another small failure to confirm what they already believed about men like him. He stopped at her table, placed the plate gently in front of her, and said, "You should eat." She looked up then, slowly, her eyes clear and steady, not startled, not grateful, just present, as if she had been expecting something, though maybe not this, and after a brief pause she asked, "Why?" Daniel didn't sit, didn't linger, he simply gave a small shrug and answered, "Because someone should care." For a second, no one spoke, the room holding its breath in that subtle way people do when they're not sure if they've just witnessed kindness or foolishness, and then the sounds returned. Chairs scraping, quiet chuckles, the low murmur of people returning to their own lives. But something had shifted, something almost invisible yet undeniable, like the faint change in air before a storm. And as Daniel turned back toward the counter to settle his bill with money he no longer had, the woman lowered her gaze to the plate, her fingers brushing the edge of it not with desperation, not with relief, but with a kind of careful consideration, as if she were weighing more than just the meal in front of her, as if she were measuring something far deeper than hunger. And in that quiet moment, beneath the flicker of fluorescent lights and the indifferent rhythm of an ordinary morning, a decision began to take shape. One that no one in that diner, not the waitress, not the onlookers, and certainly not Daniel Hayes, could have possibly understood yet, but one that would soon turn silence into something no one could ignore. Daniel placed a few crumpled bills on the counter, smoothing them out with quiet care, as if respect could somehow stretch their value, and the cashier counted them twice before giving a short nod that carried no warmth, only confirmation. While behind him the low murmur of the diner resumed its usual rhythm, conversations drifting back into place as though nothing meaningful had happened. Yet Daniel lingered for half a second longer than necessary, not to check his change, not to defend himself, but because something in the air felt different, like a note that had not fully resolved. He glanced once over his shoulder and saw her again, the woman at the corner table, now holding the fork but not eating yet, her gaze lowered, her expression unreadable, and for a moment he wondered if he had misread everything. If perhaps kindness had landed where it was neither wanted nor understood. But then she took a small bite, slow and deliberate, and something about the way she did it, not rushed, not desperate, but thoughtful, told him that the moment had mattered, even if it would never be spoken aloud. He turned back and stepped outside into the late morning air where the chill still lingered beneath a pale sky. the sound of passing cars brushing against the quiet like distant waves, and he pulled his jacket tighter around himself before heading toward the bus stop at the corner of Maple and 3rd, his boots striking the pavement in steady rhythm, each step measured, each breath visible in the cool air. And as he walked, his thoughts did not circle around what he had lost, not the meal, not the money, but around something quieter, something deeper, the simple belief that doing the right thing did not need an audience to matter. Inside the diner, the woman sat alone, the plate now half empty, the coffee still untouched, and across the room a few patrons cast occasional glances in her direction, curiosity softened by disinterest, but she did not look up, did not acknowledge them. Instead, she reached into the inside pocket of her coat and pulled out a phone, sleek and understated, the kind that did not advertise its value, and she held it for a moment without unlocking it, as if considering not the device but the decision behind it. 3 short breaths, 2 slow blinks, 1 quiet shift, and then her thumb moved across the screen. "Send a car," she said softly when the call connected, her voice calm, even, carrying none of the fragility others might have assumed, and after a brief pause she added, "And find me everything you can on a man named Daniel Hayes," her eyes lifting just slightly toward the window where his figure had already disappeared down the street, and for the first time since she had entered the diner, there was something almost imperceptible in her expression, not a smile, not gratitude, but recognition, as if she had just seen something rare enough to be worth remembering. Outside, Daniel reached the bus stop and checked his watch, an old analog piece with a worn leather strap that had outlasted better days, and he leaned back against the cold metal bench, exhaling slowly as he watched the city move around him, unaware that somewhere behind him, in a quiet corner of an ordinary diner, a decision had already begun to rewrite the direction of his life, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet certainty he had carried when he chose to give away his last meal. And in that stillness between what was given and what would return, the world held its breath just long enough for something unseen to take root. The bus arrived with a long, tired hiss, its brakes exhaling like a machine that had seen too many mornings just like this one, and Daniel stepped on without urgency, dropping exact change into the fare box before moving toward the back where the seats were worn and the windows rattled softly with every turn. And as he sat down, he rested his hands on his knees, fingers slightly calloused, steady, the kind of hands that built things, fixed things, held on when life gave them very little to hold. 3 stops passed in silence. 2 passengers got off. 1 child laughed somewhere near the front, and Daniel simply watched the city blur by in muted tones of gray and faded storefronts, his reflection faint in the glass, not searching for anything, not expecting anything, just present in the quiet rhythm of survival. Across town, the black sedan pulled up to the diner with a precision that did not belong to that street, its polished surface reflecting the dull morning light like something out of place. And when the driver stepped out, dressed in a tailored coat that spoke of a different world entirely, the few people nearby noticed but did not understand, not yet. While inside, the woman who had sat in silence now stood near the counter, her posture unchanged, her presence still understated, yet everything around her seemed to shift subtly as the driver approached and nodded once. "Respectful, Ms. Voss," he said quietly, and the name settled into the room like a word that carried weight even before it was explained. The waitress blinked, confused, the cashier straightened, uncertain, and the woman, Elena Voss, reached for her coat with the same calm precision she had carried from the beginning, her movements unhurried, her expression composed, as if nothing about this moment required attention, yet everything about it demanded it. Outside, she paused for just a second before stepping into the car, her eyes drifting back toward the street where Daniel had disappeared earlier, and in that brief glance there was no sentiment, no visible emotion, only clarity, the kind that comes when a decision has already been made. "Do you have what I asked for?" she said once seated, her voice low, even, and the driver handed her a slim folder. "Preliminary report, ma'am," he replied, and she opened it without hesitation, her eyes scanning lines of information that painted a life in simple facts. Night shifts, a young daughter, no record of debt beyond what was expected, no history of complaint, no pattern of taking more than he gave. And for a moment, just a moment, her fingers paused on the page, not because the information was surprising, but because it confirmed something she had already seen without needing proof. Back on the bus, Daniel pulled a small photograph from his jacket pocket, worn at the edges, and looked at it briefly. A young girl smiling up at the camera with a brightness that did not match the weight of his days. And he allowed himself a quiet breath, not of relief, not of regret, but of purpose, before sliding it back into place as the bus slowed to his stop. 3 steps down, 2 blocks ahead, one narrow street leading to a modest building where life waited without ceremony. And as he walked, the world around him remained unchanged, unaware that somewhere not far away, a woman who owned more than most people could imagine had just decided that a man who owned very little might be exactly what she had been searching for. And in that quiet intersection of 2 very different lives, something had begun to move, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that would soon turn ordinary into unforgettable. By late afternoon, the light had shifted into that muted gold that settled over the city like a quiet promise, and inside a modest apartment on the 3rd floor of a worn brick building, Daniel Hayes stood at the small kitchen counter, carefully slicing an apple into even pieces, his movements slow and precise, not out of habit alone, but out of intention, as if even the smallest acts deserved attention when they were done for someone else. And from the living room came the soft hum of a cartoon, playing too quietly to follow, just loud enough to fill the silence, while his daughter Emily sat cross-legged on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes focused but calm, the kind of calm that came from learning early that not every day needed to be loud to be good. 3 slices on the plate, 2 more beside it, one set gently aside just in case she wanted more, and Daniel carried it over, placing it on the coffee table with a faint smile that did not ask for anything. In return, "You did your homework?" he asked, his voice low, steady, and Emily nodded without looking away from the screen. "All of it," she said, then paused before adding, "Did you eat today?" The question hung there for a moment, light but knowing, and Daniel leaned back slightly, resting his hands on his hips. "I will later," he answered, not quite a lie, not quite the truth, just enough to keep the balance he had learned to maintain. And Emily glanced at him then, her eyes sharp in a way children's eyes often are when they understand more than they say. But she did not press. She simply picked up a slice and took a bite, and the room settled into that quiet rhythm again, the kind that did not need to explain itself. Across town, in a building that rose high above the noise and movement of the streets below, glass walls catching the last light of the day, Elena Voss stood at the edge of her office, looking out over a city that moved because she made decisions, because she signed papers, because entire systems shifted when she chose to act. And yet in that moment, none of it seemed to hold her attention the way a single, quiet memory did. A man standing in a diner, offering his only meal without hesitation, without calculation, without expectation, and behind her, a voice broke the silence. "The board is ready whenever you are," her assistant said, composed, efficient, and Elena did not turn immediately, did not rush. She simply nodded once. "Give me 5 minutes," she replied, her tone calm but final, and when the door closed again, she walked slowly to her desk where the folder still lay open, Daniel's name printed plainly at the top, ordinary letters carrying extraordinary weight in a world that often confused value with visibility. 3 notes written in the margin, 2 questions circled, 1 decision already made, and she picked up her phone again, dialing without hesitation. "Set up a meeting," she said when the line connected. "Not at the office, somewhere neutral." A pause, then more precise. "And make sure he does not know who I am yet." Her reflection faint in the glass behind her, steady, controlled, but somewhere beneath that control, something quieter had begun to take shape, something that did not belong to contracts or boardrooms or balance sheets, something that could not be measured the way everything else in her world was measured. Back in the apartment, Daniel turned off the kitchen light and sat down on the edge of the couch, the day settling into his bones like it always did, not heavy, not overwhelming, just present. And Emily leaned slightly against his arm, not asking for anything, just being there. And he rested his hand gently on her shoulder, eyes forward, breath even, unaware that somewhere beyond the walls of his small, ordinary life, A decision had already been set into motion, one that would soon cross into his world without warning, without noise, but with the kind of quiet certainty that changes everything without needing to announce itself. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just a pale blue sky stretching quietly over the city and the faint hum of early traffic rising like a distant tide. And Daniel Hayes was already awake before the alarm had a chance to sound, standing at the kitchen sink rinsing a chipped coffee mug with the same steady rhythm he carried through every part of his life, while the scent of cheap ground coffee filled the small apartment. Not rich, not bold, but enough to start the day. 3 spoonfuls measured carefully, 2 cups poured, 1 left untouched for later, and he glanced toward the hallway where Emily's door remained slightly open, a soft sign that she was still asleep, and for a moment he allowed himself to stand still, hands resting on the counter, eyes unfocused, not thinking about what he lacked, but about what needed to be done next. The quiet discipline of a man who understood that survival was not about sudden change, but about showing up again and again without losing who you were. Across the city, sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling glass in a conference room where voices carried sharp edges of urgency. Charts projected against sleek walls, numbers discussed with precision and speed. But at the head of the table, Elena Voss sat in silence, her fingers lightly touching the edge of a folder that did not belong among quarterly reports or acquisition strategies. And as one executive spoke about expansion margins and projected returns, she listened without interruption, her expression calm, her posture composed, yet her attention was elsewhere, anchored to a different kind of calculation entirely. 3 proposals presented, 2 approved without hesitation, 1 delayed with a single quiet sentence. And when the room finally paused, she closed the folder and looked up, her voice even, measured. "We are not just building profit," she said, not raising her tone, not forcing authority, but carrying it naturally. "We are building trust." And the room fell still in that subtle way people do when they recognize something deeper than strategy, something that cannot be argued with because it does not need to be. Back in the apartment, Emily stepped into the kitchen rubbing her eyes, her hair slightly tangled, her presence soft but grounding, and Daniel turned immediately, pouring her a glass of milk without being asked. "You ready for school?" he said, and she nodded, climbing onto the chair as if the day had already decided its course. "Can we walk today?" she asked, and Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, calculating time, distance, the weight of responsibilities waiting for him, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, we can walk," because sometimes the shortest path was not the one that mattered most. Outside, the air carried that crisp edge of early morning, footsteps steady on the sidewalk, Emily's hand lightly wrapped around his, and they moved through the neighborhood without hurry, without noise, just 2 lives moving forward in quiet alignment, unaware that somewhere not far away, a different kind of movement had already begun. In a small cafe chosen for its anonymity rather than its quality, a table near the window sat reserved under no name, no sign, just a quiet arrangement waiting for something to arrive. And Elena stood outside for a brief moment before entering, her reflection faint in the glass, not as a CEO, not as a name that carried weight, but as a woman who had seen something rare and chosen not to ignore it. 3 steps forward, 2 breaths steady, 1 decision already set. And as she took her seat, she glanced at the empty chair across from her, knowing that soon, very soon, the quiet man who had given without asking would step into a moment that would not ask for anything in return, but would reveal everything instead. The message arrived just after noon, quiet and unexpected, the kind that did not announce itself with urgency, but carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. And Daniel Hayes read it twice, then a third time, standing just outside the auto shop where the smell of oil and metal clung to the air like a second skin, his phone held loosely in his hand, as if the words might change if he did not grip them too tightly. "You are invited to a private meeting today at 1:30 p.m. location." Attached, no name, no explanation, just a time and a place. And for a moment he almost dismissed it, almost slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned to the steady rhythm of tightening bolts and wiping grease from his hands. But something in the simplicity of it held him there, not suspicion, not excitement, but curiosity shaped by instinct. 3 seconds of silence, 2 shallow breaths, 1 quiet decision, and he looked up toward the garage where his co-worker Mike leaned against a tool chest, watching him with mild interest. "You good?" Mike asked, casual but observant, and Daniel gave a small nod. "Yeah, just got something to take care of," he replied, his voice even, not offering more because he did not have more to offer, not yet. Across town, the cafe remained calm, the soft clink of porcelain cups and low conversation weaving together into a gentle background hum. And Elena Voss sat near the window, her posture relaxed but precise, a cup of tea untouched in front of her, her attention fixed not on the street outside but on the empty chair across from her, as if the space itself held meaning, as if it were already occupied by something unseen. 3 glances toward the door, 2 sips of cooling tea, 1 moment of stillness that stretched just long enough to feel intentional. And then the door opened, the small bell above it chiming softly as Daniel stepped inside, his presence unassuming, his jacket still carrying the faint scent of the shop, his eyes scanning the room not with urgency, but with quiet awareness. And when they landed on her, there was no immediate recognition, only a subtle pause, the kind that comes when something feels familiar before the mind can explain why. He approached slowly, stopping just short of the table. "I got a message," he said, not demanding answers, not assuming anything, just stating a fact. And Elena looked up at him with the same steady gaze she had held in the diner, unchanged, composed. "I sent it," she replied, her voice calm, her tone carrying neither apology nor authority, just clarity. A brief silence settled between them, not awkward, not strained, but measured, like 2 people standing at the edge of something neither of them needed to rush. And Daniel pulled out the chair, sitting down without hesitation, his movements simple, grounded. "Do I know you?" he asked, and Elena's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement of the moment itself. "Not yet," she said, her eyes holding his in a way that did not challenge, but did not retreat either. And for a second, just a second, the sounds of the cafe seemed to fade, the world narrowing to the space between them, where questions did not need to be loud to be heard. Outside, the city continued without pause, cars moving, people passing, lives unfolding in their ordinary patterns. But inside that small cafe, something had shifted, something quiet and deliberate. And as Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table, his posture steady, Elena reached into her bag and placed the folder gently between them, not opening it, not explaining it, just letting it sit there as a presence. And in that moment, before a single page was turned, before a single truth was spoken, the balance between 2 very different worlds hung in perfect stillness, waiting for one simple act to break it. Daniel's eyes moved from her face to the folder resting between them, not reaching for it immediately, not out of hesitation but out of instinct, the kind that told him this was not just paper, not just information, but something that carried weight beyond what it showed on the surface. And he leaned back slightly, his voice steady. "You went through a lot of trouble to find me," he said, not accusing, not impressed, just stating what was already clear, and Elena did not deny it, did not soften it. She simply nodded once. "I did," she replied, her tone calm, unshaken, and then she added, "Because you are not easy to find unless you are looking for the right things." A pause settled between them, brief but intentional, and Daniel's brow lowered just slightly, not in confusion but in focus, as if he were aligning pieces that had not yet fully connected. 3 seconds passed. 2 people at nearby tables glanced over. 1 moment held steady, and then Daniel reached forward, opening the folder with a quiet motion that did not draw attention but carried purpose, his eyes scanning the first page, then the next, lines of his own life laid out in simple detail, facts stripped of context, numbers without stories, and he closed it halfway through, not needing to read further to understand what kind of access it represented. "Why?" he asked, looking back up at her, the question simple but grounded. And Elena met his gaze, without shifting. "Because you gave something without needing to know who I was," she said, her voice even, and for a brief second something softer moved beneath it, not visible, but present. "That is rare," she added, and Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, not in pride, not in discomfort, but in recognition of a truth he had never thought to name. "It was just a meal," he replied, almost dismissively. And Elena shook her head once, slow, deliberate. "No," she said. "It was a choice." The words landing quietly, but with clarity that did not need to be emphasized, and the air between them shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough to be felt. Outside the window, a car passed, sunlight catching its surface for a moment before it disappeared. Inside the cafe, a spoon tapped lightly against a cup. Someone laughed softly, life continuing in its ordinary rhythm. Yet at that table, something deeper had taken hold. "So what is this?" Daniel asked after a moment, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the folder, not claiming it, not rejecting it, just acknowledging its presence. And Elena leaned forward slightly, her posture still composed, but now carrying a different kind of focus. "I am building something," she said, choosing her words with precision. "Not a company, not another expansion. Something that requires people who understand what cannot be taught." She paused, just long enough for the meaning to settle. "And I think you might be one of them." Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, and he looked down at the folder again, then back at her. "You do not know anything about me," he said, not defensive, not dismissive, just grounded in reality. And Elena's expression did not change. "I know enough," she replied. And then, after a brief silence, she added, "I know what you do when no one is watching." The words landed differently, not as information, but as understanding, and for the first time since he sat down, Daniel did not respond immediately. 3 heartbeats passed, 2 thoughts crossed his mind. One realization settled quietly beneath them all, and the noise of the cafe seemed to pull back just slightly, as if giving space to something that did not need to be rushed. And in that stillness, the question was no longer whether this moment mattered, but how far it would reach once it moved forward. Daniel did not reach for the folder again, not because he was dismissing it, but because he had already understood what it represented, and instead he folded his hands loosely on the table, his posture steady, his voice calm. "And what exactly do you think I am supposed to do with something like this?" he asked, not challenging, not skeptical, just grounded in a reality that did not bend easily to unfamiliar offers. And Elena did not rush to answer. She allowed the question to sit between them, for a moment, as if it deserved space to exist fully before being addressed. 3 quiet seconds passed. 2 soft sounds from the cafe drifted back into awareness. One decision shaped her next words, and she leaned forward slightly, her tone still even, but now carrying a deeper clarity. "I am not offering you money," she said. "Not in the way you think." And Daniel's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in suspicion, but in focus. "Then what are you offering?" he replied, and Elena met his gaze. Without hesitation, "A position," she said, simple, direct, one that requires trust, judgment, and the ability to choose people over profit when it matters most. She paused briefly, then added, "I have people who can build systems, I have people who can run numbers, but I do not have enough people who know how to act when there is nothing to gain." The words settled into the space between them with a quiet weight, not persuasive, not forceful, just true. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back, slightly as he considered her, not the offer, not the title she had not yet fully explained, but her, the way she spoke, the way she held herself, the absence of exaggeration or urgency. And for a moment he looked past the surface of the situation, searching for something that could not be written in a file or explained in a sentence. Outside, the light had shifted again, clouds moving slowly across the sky, softening the brightness into something more subdued, and inside, the cafe continued its steady rhythm, unaware that at one small table, a decision was forming that would ripple far beyond its walls. "You still have not told me who you are," Daniel said after a moment, his voice quiet but firm, and Elena's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, something that suggested the moment had arrived. "My name is Elena Voss," she said, the name spoken without emphasis, without expectation, as if it were just another piece of information, and Daniel nodded once, the name landing without immediate recognition. "Okay," he replied, waiting, and Elena held his gaze for a second longer before continuing. "I own Voss Industries," she said, and this time, The words did not need to be explained, because even without context, the way she said it carried a different kind of weight. Not pride, not display, but fact. For a brief second, the sounds of the cafe seemed to pull back again, not because anything had changed around them, but because something had shifted within the space they occupied, and Daniel's eyes remained on hers, not widening, not reacting in the way most people might expect, just steady, absorbing the information without letting it define the moment. 3 breaths passed, 2 thoughts surfaced. One realization settled quietly beneath them all, and he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. "So you are telling me," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully, "that this is not about what I did, it is about what you think I might do next." And Elena's lips curved just slightly, not a smile, but acknowledgement. "Exactly," she said, and in that instant, the balance shifted once more, not toward wealth, not toward power, but toward something far more rare, something that could not be bought or assigned, only recognized, and the room, though unchanged, seemed to hold its breath just long enough to feel it. Daniel did not answer right away, not because he did not understand the weight of what had just been said, but because he did, and understanding it meant he had to be careful with what came next, and he shifted slightly in his seat, his hands still resting calmly on the table, his gaze steady on Elena, not impressed, not intimidated, just present. "I think you might be wrong," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, and Elena did not react with surprise or offense. She simply tilted her head slightly, listening. "I am not the kind of person you are looking for," Daniel continued. "I do not have experience with companies like yours. I do not know your world." And for a moment the words hung there, honest, unpolished, the kind of truth that most people would try to soften, but he did not, because he had never learned to pretend. 3 seconds passed. 2 people at a nearby table glanced over again. One quiet shift in the air settled between them, and Elena leaned back slightly, her expression unchanged. "That is exactly why I am here," she said, her tone calm, almost certain, and Daniel's brow lowered just a fraction. "People who belong to my world already know how to protect it," she continued. "I need someone who knows how to protect what matters before it becomes a system." The words landed differently this time, not as an offer, but as a perspective, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before returning to her, not searching for answers, but measuring something deeper, something that could not be explained in titles or roles. Outside, a light breeze moved through the street, carrying the faint sound of distant traffic, and inside, the cafe remained unchanged, cups being refilled, quiet conversations continuing. Yet at that table, something had reached its turning point, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that could not be undone. "What happens if I say no?" Daniel asked after a moment, his voice steady, not testing, just asking, and Elena did not hesitate. "Then nothing changes," she said, simple, direct. "You go back to your life, and I continue searching." A pause, then softer. "But I do not think I will find many like you." And for the first time, something almost human moved through her tone, not emotion, not vulnerability, but respect, quiet and unspoken. Daniel leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the